Welcome to this Airwalk Reply podcast, The Big Questions in Tech, hosted by Hammond. Joining him are service management specialists Oliver Hibbitt and Justin Allum from Airwalk Reply. Together they tackle the big questions in service management.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode of The Big Questions in Tech with Airwalk Reply. I'm your host, Hammond. Joining me today, Justin Allum and Ollie Hibbitt. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining.
How are you?
Cheers. Quick 30 seconds on you guys and your backgrounds.
So my name's Oliver Hibbitt. I'm a current sort of senior consultant at Airwalk Reply. I've got about 11 years now, I think it is, in sort of mainly in service management, but obviously touching on other areas of there as well, a bit of project management and stuff in there.
Thanks, Ollie.
I'm Justin Allum, also a senior consultant at Airwalk Reply. I've got 30-something years experience in IT.
You're dwarfing me then.
Probably about 15 of those in service delivery, service management. Really looking forward to covering some of the topics that we're going to discuss today.
So let's kick off with setting a bit of context, because I think service management as a topic is maybe not something where you grab, and you've got an anecdote you're going to tell us in a second.
Be a bit dry,
maybe if you sort of grab someone on the street and go, we're talking about service management, it's probably not, in the realms of technology, AI is probably something that people are quite excited about. It's probably a bit more foundational now. Let's kick off the set some context. What is service management? Why is it important?
When I arrived, I was here super early this morning, so I went to grab a coffee, walked down to the end of the road, was chatting to the guy who was doing the coffee, and he said, on your way to work? And I went, no, actually, I'm recording a podcast this morning. And he went, what's that about? And I was like, oh my God, I'm on the spot now. And I went, it's an IT thing. And he kind of looked at me. I think I was already losing him at that point. And I said, it's kind of related to things like service desk. And he kind of went, oh, great. And I was like, yeah, no, honestly, it's really exciting. But I think at that point I'd lost him. I think that is interesting, when you ask, I say, people in the street, it's like, what is service management? And there's probably a certain view. I suspect if you talk to CTOs, CIOs, that kind of level, they'll kind of say, well, service management is that integral part of our organisation, part of IT. It's that heartbeat of the service that we provide to IT, to the user base, right? If you're a user, then your experience of service management is probably what you get from service desk. My laptop is broken. But the service desk and that service is driven through SLAs, which is what your IT department can realistically deliver to you, not necessarily what the user requires, right? Then at the other end of the spectrum, if you are one of those CTOs, CIOs, your kind of service management is driven around like monthly reporting that says, how many incidents have we had? What's our availability look like? What's our mean time to resolve? And then, you have those kind of P1 incidents, and your C-suite level are asking the question. It's like, what was the cause? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? So everything is very, very reactive. It's very sort of point in time, rather than looking at a much more broader picture going, well, actually, how do we reduce the number of incidents that we actually get, rather than focus on kind of, I don't know, something a little bit more sort of short term.
It's obviously very integral to the business. It's not the backroom function that it was 80s, 90s, 10 years ago.
But how many organisations do we think see it that way? How many organisations recognise that? So what you've just described there is that service management is ultimately the fundamental experience of most users within a business. It's how they interact with technology, which is the be-all and end-all of most businesses today. So it's pretty important. It's also responsible for, if we think about regulated industries that we normally work in, operational resilience is it's a pretty fundamental part of that. So it's a pretty strategic thing to get right, potentially. How many organisations do we think see it that way and treat it that way?
I think it comes down to the maturity of the organisation. It's a bit of a spectrum at the moment. So at the moment, I think most organisations, it is a tactical thing rather than a strategic thing. We see it all the time when, let's say you're delivering big projects. The focus is always on, right, we've got these delivery timescales to meet. We've got to deliver this project by this date. All the focus has to be on that. When actually, what about when it actually gets stood up? Who's actually going to be supporting it? Who's going to be, when something goes wrong, where do you go to? What are the races? Who are the responsibilities? All this kind of stuff just gets forgotten about. And service management, I think, still is a bit of an afterthought at the moment for most organisations. It's not in all, obviously. But it's that sort of, it's considered, it's a bit of a blocker to delivery. We just need to get this project over the line. And I think that's where potentially some organisations are getting it wrong. It needs to be an integral part of the service design from the get-go.
Yeah, and also there's no potential sort of consideration in terms of resource requirements as well. So deliver that new product.
Because it's not part of the design.
No,
right?
because it's not part of the design. So there'll be a whole load of work done in terms of what does this mean from a delivery point of view. We need this extra resource. We need this to get this delivered. But actually, when it's in, it's always like, then it's like over to your sort of operations department. It's like, oh, you now need to cope with this as well as, you know, if you've got a large organisation that's then delivering 4 or 5 things all at the same time, that then creates a real sort of squeeze onto that department, which then means levels of service start to drop. But nobody looks at it again more strategic, more holistically to go, actually, what's the cause of that? It's, you know, all of a sudden our service desk is not performing as well as it could do or has done. What's gone wrong there? And then it's all a bit late to turn around and say, well, because we're now supporting 5 more big things that we've not done before.
Do you think that's almost sort of endemic of a sort of the fact that they're still quite like service management still works in quite siloed teams and it's a bit separate from the business?
Throwing over the fence.
Yeah.
I've done it now. Let's throw it over the fence.
It's like there's not that sort of join up. Like service management isn't fully aligned to sort of some of the business teams when maybe it should be.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there is probably not fully understanding the value that you're getting out of service management. So I guess if you're in a more product-led sort of structure...
I was about to ask, how big a change is that? Moving to a product-led operating model where I guess the team that's building the product is also servicing the product. Does that address that, or does it still have a similar issue?
No, I think the issue still exists, but probably from a service management perspective or a service management team perspective, you'd like to think you've got some allies in your product team because you've got an IT team that are also accountable for the service. So then perhaps instead of traditionally where you would have your service management team almost battling with another IT team in terms of trying to explain the kind of so what of what we're doing, right? You know, and would you believe I've had that challenge, you know, an engineering person saying to me, yeah, so what? It's like, well, you're questioning what I'm actually trying to do. You know, it's a very real world problem. But then you get those kind of allies in your sort of product team, but you've still got to get that across to your your product owner, your business person, because they're going, well, okay, you know, you're saying to me that I need to, you know, we've had an incident and I need to fix all these things to stop my incident happening again. Well, that's not going to make me any money. That's not going to generate any revenue. I've got a product over here. If I delay that, that's £1 million we're not making. You know, where's the thing there? And the battle there is really trying to explain that actually, okay, it's not generating revenue, but what you're doing is we're helping protect the investment you've already made by putting the other features live, and we're protecting the customer experience of your existing features. No point you developing a new product, a new feature, if all your customers are fed up with the level of service they're getting, because you won't get the benefit from it.
That appreciation is hard to measure sometimes. Though, isn't it? And that's part of the problem.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
so
it is.
We're going to get on to.
Yeah, exactly. You can't. It's really hard to put a financial value on, like I said, what you can get out of service management. Really difficult, and I think that's the real challenge.
So let's go into, I guess, a bit more detail around then. What does bad service management look like? I suppose we touched on a few things there, but what are the kind of headlines for you guys in terms of, so reactive seems to be one.
Yeah,
so very reactive.
Engaging service management too late. So,
okay.
You're sort of almost doomed to fail.
So I guess that's there's a reactivity in terms of, if you were to sum up a service desk, a service management approach, and how they provide that service, someone being too reactive. I guess there's something about the delivery life cycle and it then coming too late in the process, which is sort of slightly different things, aren't they? What are other elements, I guess? Like, I think we probably see quite a bit of legacy approaches to things, I guess, right? In terms of not leveraging platforms in the right way, being quite manual and people-driven. I
suppose there's one around sort of the lack of sort of using your ITSM tool sort of correctly is a big one. So let's not be funny. These things are not cheap to run, like especially some of the top end ones, you know, for larger organizations, which they tend to go for. But if you have this very expensive tool, but you're not using it properly, so the people at the top are like, well, what value are we getting from this then? The people actually using it, so it's even worse for them because they're having a terrible end user experience. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of just, well, this is just useless. What usually happens is they start sort of circumventing processes because this thing is just hamstringing them in place and they can't deliver what they need to do. So you're in this horrible sort of downward spiral of just not getting value from it. And, you know, I've even seen it, you know, in my sort of personal working experience. We had, you know, an ITSM tool that wasn't out of the box. Well, originally was out of the box, but it was so configured and so modified that it made basically every single time we had to do any kind of upgrade or change to it just a massive uphill slog. The amount of testing that we had to do, and like, you know, people were just so fed up with it. And it was, you know, so getting that right, you know, you're sort of halfway there, but getting it wrong, and then you know, you're in real trouble.
Yeah, and the reason that you buy an ITSM tool is that it gives you the capability of linking those kind of processes together. But again, you know, we talked earlier on, it's another kind of those siloed approaches. So there's like, we have an incident management module, right? So that runs incident. We have a change management module. We have a problem management module. Well, actually, as an organization, how do all of those three things start to link together? What are the points that we need to, you know, bring those in? How can we use what we've learned over here in incident to make us better at change, for example, you know? And organizations miss out on all of that because they get the thing in and they go, right, done. It's very expensive to run. It's running that part. It's running that part. It's running that part. Missing again that real sort of holistic view that you can get from having one tool. I mean, that's the point of having a tool, isn't it?
And we touched on that earlier, isn't it? Is the fact that service management is still not properly aligned to the business in the right way. It's still those siloed teams, and having that sort of cultural shift to make them all together in one sort of fusion team, I suppose you could call it, is a real way to sort of maybe.
Yeah. And I guess slightly linked to the ITSM piece is, I'm going to say it, you know, the use of something like ITIL, we see organisations who say that they are, you know, they comply with ITIL. No, and I find that very, very interesting.
What does that mean?
Because ITIL is not a standard to comply with. You can't be, an organisation cannot be ITIL certified, you know, or individuals are ITIL certified. ITIL for me is a framework, and you know, it's not just an ITIL framework. An IT framework. You can, ITIL can apply right across the organisation much more broadly. But for me, it's like you pick the bits out of ITIL that actually work best for you. You don't need to use every single practice that's in the book, you know.
Of course not.
But it feels like either organisations are not really using it at all when, you know, years have been put into developing the framework in order to help organisations kind of come up with a good way of working, let's say, or you've got the other end, which organisations are almost using it a bit like a crutch in some respects. It's going, it's all right, we are ITIL compliant or something, and it's like, well, what does that actually mean?
We had a very similar when we talked with Costas and Dave about security in the podcast that we talked about kind of modernisation of security, and Dave has some pretty disparaging things to say. The equivalent for in that world is kind of ISO standards and certifications and things. And again, it's exactly the same thing. An organisation is pointing at those and saying, nothing to see here. We've got our ISO. It's fine.
Yeah.
But it's a crutch. It's kind of
it's how you apply it, isn't it?
It's not the mindset that says we are going to be a highly secure organisation, in the same way that it's not the mindset that says we are going to deliver a world-class technology service to our users and our customers. And if ITIL is a framework that enables us to do that and put some structure around it, great. But I think, there's this sort of assertion that, well, we've got ITIL, so we're done.
Yeah,
and like that.
And also sort of following on to that, there's perhaps sometimes a lack of appreciating the need to do sort of continuous improvement on those things. Again, it's we have an incident management process, right? Tick, move on. Yeah. Right. Well, the business moves on. And if that process doesn't, that's when you end up in a world where those processes start being seen as kind of things that block, stop delivery, bureaucracy, red tape, all of those kind of things, because they don't keep up. And it's the responsibility of like service management to some extent to make sure they keep up. Yeah. But there's also got to be an appreciation from a slightly more strategic view that's needed.
But I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? I've always found this problem with continuous improvement. People, CSI, we're doing CSI. Well, when we get the time to do CSI, and often you don't get the time, and it leads back to we're more tactical than strategic. We don't have time to do this, and if you can get that mindset moved to strategic, then suddenly continuous improvement basically forms the sort of it's the core of all of that.
I was going to say, do you think there's almost an excessive focus on change and projects potentially, certainly in the world that we operate in, and insufficient investment and focus on what you would say is BAU ultimately, but actually the whole point is the service that's running. The change bit is just an enabler for that.
Yeah.
And yet, the investment and the focus and the innovation doesn't necessarily happen kind of post go live as much, does it? And that's where service management potentially can play a bigger role.
But this needs to come down from the top, right? You cannot have any of this change happening without sort of this key stakeholder buy-in that sort of that appreciate this and understand the value of what this is bringing. Otherwise, there's no point, people at sort of like a service desk manager who might understand all of this, but ultimately he can't sort of force the change through himself.
But we see all the time that the number of times that we when budgets get squeezed, it's about, right, we need to bring operating costs down. Yeah. So that gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. We want to deliver the same for less every year upon year. 2-3 years down the line, you're suddenly on 50% of the budget. Yeah. And wondering why your service isn't very good anymore and why it hasn't evolved and why it's falling over a lot. I think that's the thing for me. The penny drop for me when it was like, actually, service management is not about service desk. That is one component of it. It is about how are you running your IT services. Yeah. And that might be revenue generating. It might be the fuel that runs your organization from a tech perspective, but it's fundamental, isn't it? And so, the organizations that recognize that, and you got to look at, the usual suspects, Google, Amazon, Facebook, like if their platforms are their product, there's no change element to, like, we're going to do a big program and launch a new thing. The last time those guys launched a big thing, like Instagram's been around a long time, Facebook's been like, the lifeblood is in that product, isn't it? And so their whole business is built around continuous improvement and evolution of those products. That's not to say they don't launch new things, but 90% of their business is about that thing. It doesn't feel like your more traditional organizations think that way. It's always about the new shiny thing, I guess. Isn't it?
But they're in different ways of working, aren't they? So they're sort of more thinking like agile and DevOps and sort of that sort of mindset, and then it's sort of getting service management to sort of work with that, because that service management is quite.
It's just it's just a part of it, though, isn't it?
It is.
It's delivery of the service and doing it well.
But it's what you said earlier on. It's about that cultural shift. DevOps is is almost cultural. Agile. Cultural shift to work in that way. There needs to be that appreciation that actually you need a cultural shift within service management as well that needs to happen at that kind of organizational level. So again, talking about continual service improvement, it is very much a kind of side of desk, again in my experience, what you have to do is you have to almost aspire to do something. You go in the quarter, we will attempt to make this improvement, knowing that you're going to have to deal with the reactive nature. But if you don't at least aspire or try or plan to do something, you never will. But what that's happening is it all happening at a very low level, because what you're doing is, again, you're doing your continuous improvement probably in reaction to something else. It's like, well, we need to be better in this area,
problem management, all these
or even in terms of, like, we want to do some analysis to understand. Going back to service desk, we want to understand how we deal with tickets better. But then, you've got a challenge around the quality of the data. It's like, well, okay, we're going to spend the next 3 months encouraging our service desk people to be better at capturing the stuff. Then you can do some analysis. But it's all very like, that's just going to allow us this. There's no...
Even that separation is kind of, again, I don't imagine that Gaffer are managing their products that way. The notion, there's a problem and there's a ticket, and let's investigate that from a service desk perspective. Product owner in those organizations that's the lifeblood of what they're doing to make sure that they're continually evolving the product, isn't it? So it feels like agile DevOps kind of product ways of working is trying to move to a model where everything is ongoing. It's ongoing. It's living and breathing. It's fluid. You're never at the end, because there's no such thing as the end. Moving away from slightly more binary kind of gated approach to things, which is, in a really traditional sense, it's right, we're going to gather a bunch of requirements for 9 months, and then we're going to build the thing for 12 months, and then we're going to put it into BAU and actually move on to the next thing. And that is what leads to quite poor product outcomes, quite poor service outcomes.
So it's almost about having a sort of a North Star objective. Is just, on the 3 months we are going to be working on this, but these are all sort of enabling us to get to eventually.
That just happens to be the thing you're working in that 3 months. The next 3 months will be something. It's because it's not. It's trying to move away from that change and delivery into BAU mindset, and I think bringing service closer into that and changing the operating model and the mindset is quite fundamental.
It's becoming product-led, isn't it?
Well, that, I think, is a big part of it. It feels like, isn't it? In that operating model of IT, is rather than saying, right, that's your service function and that's your change and product function, or whatever, that's nonsense. Because if what they're doing over here should be quite fundamental. If it isn't, well, then what's going to happen with that product? Like it's going to deteriorate pretty quickly.
And I guess within that product
develop,
structure, you know, that product structure kind of solves the problem of how do you make sure, from a delivery point of view, IT and the business are aligned on the outcomes they're trying to achieve, and service management kind of needs to move into that as well. So the outcomes, the outcomes for the product need to include the service part of that. And again, that's not something that
are we seeing that? Are we seeing product teams that have service really kind of baked in, or are we still seeing? Is that the next evolution? Where actually at the moment, it's product teams.
Well, I've seen it to a point, but that was very much driven by the particular CTO in that organisation, who kind of led that in terms of, right, this is how this is going to work.
Yeah.
What's going to happen is if we have an incident, the whole team stops working. And this is, I don't know whether this is applying the and on-call principle of Toyota, right? So Toyota production line, obviously making cars. If there's a fault on that production line, the whole production stops. They pull the cord, everything stops. So applied the same principle to product teams. Really, really interesting to take a concept in manufacturing and apply it to IT. Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
But so he had this principle, and coming from the CTO, so everybody in the team is like, we've got an incident, the whole team stops.
Yeah.
Right. That's quite an expensive decision to make, but it was a great place to start, because the way that then evolved was everybody stops, everybody sort of swarms on the incident, and then ultimately there's a kind of, okay, well, you two carry on looking at it. Everybody get back to work. But the evolution of that was that, okay, over time, it's like, we'll win the team, we'll allocate 2 people, will be you'll pick up an incident should happen, everybody. So the team kind of learned to still conform or comply with the requirement of you must stop, but actually not stop production entirely. So there is that, and that's really good. But that, I think, is quite rare, and that probably came more from the sort of CTO, you know, driving that, rather than it wasn't the product, you know, the product owner's not leading that. The product owner, that would be the absolute kind of, I don't know what the ideal in that situation, rather than it being IT led, your product owner kind of going, right, we've got a problem, let's stop.
So I wonder if in the industries that we work in, I feel like from an incident perspective, those are taken quite seriously. Because the implications are fairly significant. As much as anything, for the people that sit in those CIO, CTO roles, if they want to keep them, incidents are a pretty key metric for them. Probably more so than innovation and those sorts of things, actually. So I wonder, I actually think it's almost like, what's their response to the next layer of impact down? So like if there's an incident and there's an outage, most teams do end up taking that pretty seriously, I think, in financial services, public sector, etc.
That's why we have the priority system, right?
I just wonder if it's defects and it's the technical debt, and it's things that degrade the service but maybe don't stop the service, or it's things like that. I think there's still a maturity curve there that people need to go through, that recognise that is, it's not a separate thing that these people over here are dealing with, and they'll let us know when it has to be part of a living, breathing product backlog that is taken seriously, and then it's all prioritised, right? So if a defect isn't a higher priority than a bunch of other things, well, that is still the product owner's prerogative, isn't it?
Yeah.
But integrating that in more closely is quite quite
I guess it's an issue we see with sort of larger, sort of older companies, right, who have that legacy sort of debt and all that sort of currency problem to deal with, whereas sort of newer companies who've moved directly to the cloud have sort of almost pushed that problem away from themselves onto the cloud provider to sort a little bit.
It depends on the problem, doesn't it? But potentially, I think. I mean, it never fails to amaze me how many we work with lots of startups and kind of more sort of nascent organisations. They've still got plenty of technical debt because their drivers tend to be about rushing to a finish line. Right? How do we get the next level of funding, or how do we get our license? How do we get something launched so we can start bringing revenue in, so we can start paying everybody salaries from that rather than funding? So different drivers lead to often similar outcomes. They've built things on cloud, but they've built them in odd ways and different things. So I think there's still a balance.
And there's and to that point, I think there's still a kind of misalignment between, you know, a business outcome and almost like IT objectives. So again, if your CTO, as you said, CTO has an objective to, I don't know, reduce mean time to recover or reduce the number of incidents. Business product owner has an objective to make X amount of revenue. So when you've got those kind of post-incident, your problem actions, your remedial actions that you need to do to stop the incident happening again, your CTO type level is going, well, we need to do that because that will reduce the number of incidents we have. It might help us fix the things quicker and all of that kind of stuff. Your product owners then look at it and go in, yeah, but I want to prioritize all this stuff because this will make me money, and that is still a conflict that's going to, and it's always going to be a conflict.
Yeah.
And unless there are, well, I suppose it's always going to, it's like you need those almost agreed outcomes at that business level. You need the business to kind of, again, it goes back to that, how do you put a value on that type of customer experience? Like, if
it's just protecting what you've currently got, it's different.
It's like, how much is that worth? That's right.
Absolutely.
If and I don't know how many organisations even would do this kind of analysis. It's like, we have an incident. We can understand the lost revenue at the time of the incident because we know the outage and we didn't sell or whatever it was. Yep. But actually, is there a tail to that? I don't know. It might not be one-off incident, probably not, because you're limited impact. But
so again, it's having those outcomes at the top level, which then feed down into like we sort of see with agile ways of working. You have your outcomes and your epics and your stories, and how that all sort of feeds up. Yeah. Because, and if that can be agreed, then there's sort of like it's a balance, isn't it?
So I'm of a view that anything can be quantified. You just have to dig deep enough. Yeah. So if you look at like the reputational impact of an outage for a big bank, front page of the Daily Mail or whatever your publication of choice is, hopefully not the Daily Mail. But you also got the regulator giving you a call and asking what's going on, and that may slow down a kind of approvals and moving forward of other things. I definitely think that there's an immaturity around business case in technology organisations in most of the firms that we work with, and I think this is an example of it. I think if you were to really look at the impact of customer acquisition, customer sentiment, regulator sentiment as a result of some of these outages, I don't think it is just the 2 hours where customers couldn't do X, Y, Z. I think it's much greater than that.
Reputational damage.
I mean, back in I would have thought there's a lot of customers that thought twice about getting a current account with TSB after their big outage, for example. It wasn't just the impact of the few days where they were out. It was, I think, much broader than that. So I do think there's a.
Still tricky to measure, but I don't disagree that it's
you're having to use proxies, but I think versus if we're prioritizing this, then we might make this level of revenue. Versus, I think it's an easier sell in a regulated organisation because we know that you can't do anything if the regulator won't let you, and we've seen instances where because of operational resilience challenges, organisations have had to stop trading and stop selling certain products for a period of time until they fix them. So there is a very tangible, and there's fines and all sorts of things, right? So I do think there are elements that you can put a number on and you can put a proxy against it. And then you balance that against the probability of extra revenue, which will come eventually. It's just there's a balance of priorities, isn't it? I'm not saying it's easy, but I think at the moment the view is, I can't put a number on that, so I'm not going to bother. I'm going to do these things because it's revenue generating.
Consideration needs to be given.
I think there needs to be more consideration for sure.
But that goes all the way back to having that more strategic view, doesn't it? Ultimately, raising service management up from that kind of lower level tactical
so they have the time to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's just touch on the last portion of this episode around what does good look like. I guess we've touched on some of it, haven't we? But at a high level, what does the sort of future of service management look like, and what should people be aspiring to in this space?
So interestingly, I've been trying to listen to a few podcasts actually, and trying to even look up sort of the future service management. It's not actually an awful lot on there, which is weird.
Well, we're going to change that, right?
We're going to change that, absolutely, because you sort of hear these stories of people talking about, what is ITIL or basic level service management, or here's what it was like in the 80s, or here's my personal journey or my sort of journey I've gone through from here to now. But it's very backwards facing. So it's sort of, where are we looking forward? The next 10 years, I think, are going to be very transformative. If we look where we were in 2015 to where we are now and how that's changed, it's all quite it's an exponential sort of expanding. So the next 10 years we're going to move further than we did in the last 10 years. Now, admittedly, 10 years ago, we were all working in offices, generally 5 days a week for the most part. And now lots of people can just do the job remotely. Now, COVID had a slightly big hand in that, but it just kind of shows with the use of cloud computing and all the sort of the way we share and collaborate has completely changed in 10 years. So where are we going to be in 10 years' time? Well, I know we've obviously touched on it, and I know you're dying to have another chat. But AI and automation. How that's going to go.
And we don't know, but you kind of you can look at things like, simple service desk requests. My account is locked. I need a password reset or whatever. They're prime examples for just automating. They're repeatable tasks that otherwise somebody's got to go and click a number of buttons, that they click the same buttons every time. And there are organisations already kind of automating a bunch of that stuff. But then you take that next level where actually, from a user's point of view, there's no service desk portal, for example. They can log their request through Teams or something like that, and what they get back is some message that says this has been fixed for you. There is absolutely no human interaction at all in any of that stuff.
You're saying almost no service desk, no first or second.
No, that's right. Yeah,
towards self-service.
Yeah, I guess there's going to be an evolution of that. It's like pick off all of those things that are already easy to automate. Then you start getting to the more sort of complex ones. So you could go as far as having, I need a new laptop, for example. Well, depending on all of the other things that you've put in place, you could make that almost an entirely automated process. If you've got your assets being outsourced and provided by a third party, you've almost got I'm going to say it like an Amazon style service then, isn't it? It's like, I need a new device or I need a new thing.
Well,
I get this.
Even that do you even need to have, it could be predictive, couldn't it?
Well,
you could take it to the nth degree, couldn't you?
Yeah, you could.
It feels like there's a principle, which is, I think the last 10 years in IT, particularly in the industries we work in, has been about digitizing things and maybe automating things that exist today. But I don't think we've seen a big transformation of the underlying processes and operating model. And it feels like the next 5 to 10 years, that should all completely get blown out of the water. And actually, real transformation in IT functions and IT services should be, does that process even need to exist?
Yes.
Does that team, it's not about people, right? Because the teams will evolve and focus on different things, but does that team need to exist? Do people need to raise service desk tickets? Who are they even raising them to?
So I
think be a different way of interacting with
So I think it will be almost like a hyper-personalization thing. So the data insights, which we're already kind of seeing with, I think, Microsoft Viva and various other things, but, they'll have all this data about you, know what you need. There'll be that predictive analysis. So it's a complete move away from you actually needing. It's like, your laptop is now, out of warranty. We're ordering you a new one along here.
We're tracking performance.
We're tracking performance. We're doing all this stuff.
It's on its way.
So it's almost
into the envelope. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's almost that focus around, or sort of that shift from where we have at the moment, where everything's SLA based, to XLAs, which are sort of experience based SLAs on the, that's what the user wants, and the user experience is going to, is that centric approach is completely going to drive what IT is providing to their users. So, we see this in a small way with sort of CSATs and NPS scores and things like that. But while that just kind of supplements today, I think it's going to sort of, the pendulum's going to shift. To
and I think the other thing you said there about the sort of fundamental shift is, when it comes to those things like AI automation, it's not about taking what the current process does and applying AI or automation over the top of that. It's, what is the outcome we are trying to achieve, and how is the best way to achieve that outcome? So again, take your traditional kind of change management process, where it's like, something needs to change, it needs to go into production. Here's a bunch of gates or diligence that needs to get done. It needs to be approved by this person, depending on the severity, risk, whatever of all of that kind of change. Well, actually, that's a service management control almost, isn't it? Trying to kind of maintain the level of success or reduce the number of incidents fighting change, all of that kind of stuff. Well, actually, if what you're trying to do is ultimately reduce the number of unsuccessful changes, or reduce the number of incidents you have following a change, well, actually, you don't need to do that by having someone approve that. You look at the quality that needs to be delivered all the way through, right from when you start your development, all the way through the software development lifecycle, or whatever that will look like in 10 years' time, and what are all the quality gates that need to be in place. So actually, the thing, when it's finally released to production, is so low risk, because we've done all of this stuff, doesn't need approval, and therefore you're achieving the overall objective, but you're not doing it by automating your change management process. You've effectively streamlined the whole lot. And
some of that sounds kind of very in the future, but it's here and now, right? We're building that in organizations now around, you take security as an example, security controls. It's just traditionally a very kind of audit-based gate approach. Like, let's check what you're doing, let's check what you've designed, let's check what you've built. Yes, you can go live, and then we'll come back in a year and check how you've done it and everything has changed. That's complete nonsense in reality, right? The world now is secure by design, integrated controls, automated kind of rollback, all those sorts of things. So you move into a world where actually that completely changes, and it should. This is where I think the purview of service management, or what we mean by it, broadens, I think, quite significantly potentially, because it's taking those principles and it's building that into the end-to-end life cycle, isn't it? And saying, well, the people that potentially are at the end of service desk requests or incidents, etc., should be transitioning maybe more to how do you get ahead of that? How do you get proactive around it? I mean, we did some work with an organisation last year, didn't we, about this sort of space. Actually, what's the future of the team that's responsible for that kind of change governance process? It isn't audit anymore. It's about how do they drive the experience? Sort of those SLAs. How are they getting ahead on behalf of the change community and the product community? What is it that they need? What's the next service that they need? And how does that get built and automated? And that they kind of become the product owners of that experience, don't they?
Yeah, it's service management, understanding how it supports the business in whatever the business is going to do,
as opposed to responding to when some things go wrong.
That's it.
It's
or
strategic or tactical. We keep coming back.
Exactly. Or even having a process there that is almost like forcing the business to work in a certain way. I mean, it's an interesting one. We've got to be really careful with that, because I think sometimes, we could sit here and kind of go, service management needs to make sure support the business in what the business needs to do. But actually, the purpose of service management still needs to be kind of, I guess at the moment, is still providing a certain sort of level of control and a guardrail to make sure that,
while still delivering.
That's right. Yeah. So,
but then they're just the custodians of that.
Yeah, exactly.
If they're the custodian, if they see themselves as the custodians of that rather than the vehicle for that to happen. So they're not. They shouldn't be thinking of themselves as the audit function.
Yeah.
They should be thinking of themselves as how do we make that happen, that outcome.
Yeah.
Via automation, via control. They should be the ones pushing security teams to think in a different way. All of that sort of. I think that's potentially a future role for these teams. And then it all starts to kind of coalesce into a very modern approach.
And what you've ended up with there is perhaps I guess a much more kind of trust-based approach, rather than the kind of traditional is like, you want to do that, I'm going to check your homework. And I'm going to say it's okay to do.
Because it's secure by design,
because
right?
Yeah. Whereas now it's like, well, actually what we'll do is we just need a way of reporting an exception. It's like, this is all working fine. Great. There's nothing to see here, which is absolutely what the organisation wants. Something didn't quite go right. Okay, well, perhaps that's where some human interaction is needed. It's like, why did that not quite work the way it should have worked? But hopefully they're more like exceptions than the norm.
And they'll be on dashboards and will be that. It's that sort of oversight that the service management teams will take on as a function then. It's not a case of, you need to go sort out this problem. This has been identified. We've already done it for you. We're making you aware.
Yeah.
But it means that service, it becomes more of a high-skilled, complex realm, doesn't it? It's about fewer but more gnarly, meaty, complex problems to solve versus, frankly, the sheer volume of everything that comes into service management, which, as we say, 90% of which probably should be automated or should be dealt with in a straight-through processing way.
Yeah.
But so the types of skills you might need, I suppose, will evolve.
They will evolve over time, definitely.
Yeah. And looking at something like incident management, well, we shouldn't assume that incident management is a thing that actually would still exist. Because again, as if we looked at that in terms of what's the overall,
done by humans anyway.
Not all, that's right. Yeah.
Most of it should be
proactive and automated.
Exactly. But it's right. It becomes a proactive piece, but then strictly speaking, if it's proactive and we fix something before it's actually had an impact, it's not actually an incident. So that's what I mean in terms of
under current ITIL methodologies, but that may change. I mean, the fact that what's going to be an ITIL v5, for example, there's got to be an AI element in there.
But these things,
the cost.
I guess the one consideration is that not all incidents are most incidents, but not all incidents are as a result of someone doing something wrong internally, right? So ransomware attacks and things are still going to become are going to be increasingly a thing, aren't they? So I think it feels like incidents will be a probably bigger thing than they are today. There maybe is a tiering system.
Just how it's managed will be very different.
How it's managed will be, and again, it's what's left will need to be a highly skilled team that is going to have to deal with it. The rest of it, as you say, hopefully doesn't reach the tier of incident because it's kind of dealt with.
You sort of almost those kind of day to day. You've got a bunch of kind of your event management. You've got a bunch of monitoring, alerting in place. And again, we're not talking like in the future. I mean, this is something that's there here now, right? You know, you have something here, it generates an alert that says this needs fixing. If it's not fixed in 2 hours, we're going to have an incident. There are examples of that now which require human intervention to do that fix, and that fix might be, you know, I don't know, expand this disk, restart this server, or whatever it is. But those again are things that are probably automatable. You know, it's all of that kind of stuff. But like you say, I suppose you get to a point where there's still going to be these huge things that are going to happen that
things are still going to go wrong.
You know, AI ops, that kind of machine learning is not going to be able to learn quick enough to be able to deal with those and prevent the thing from happening.
I mean, my main problem with this is just that people, end users, when I say people, no matter what, always seem to require some form of help. And I think that's obviously, you know, we talked about the self-service thing, and I think obviously it's going to have to read
time though.
Maybe, and I think, you know, like Gen AI will probably have a big sort of factor in that, but like you're never going to get away from people like, oh, people will just use, because everything will work perfectly and people will just use it as it's intended, because we know, just look at humans, that's never going to happen.
If you think about like autonomous cars, for example, like we're not that far away from a world where you're driven around by the car itself. But eventually, something will break. Something will need to be dealt with. Someone's going to have to come and pick you up. Maybe it's an autonomous tow truck.
It's not an end user, though, is it? It's still something. That's
the person in the car is, I suppose, the end user in that instance, aren't they? And so, yes, they could press the wrong buttons, I suppose. But you can legislate against that, can't you? Cool. I think that's probably all we've got time for in this episode. I think so. Cool. So we'll catch you next time for Big Questions in Tech.
Subscribe now to never miss an episode of the Big Questions in Tech.